I watched them through the reflection in the wine glass I was holding, their lips pressed together behind the hydrangea centerpiece, thinking no one could see. The rehearsal dinner was loud with laughter and champagne toasts, my future mother-in-law crying happy tears at table 3, my father clapping cousins on the back near the bar, but I saw everything. The restaurant had those floor-to-ceiling mirrors along the east wall, the kind that made the private dining room look twice as big, and in that glass I watched my best friend since freshman year at Howard University slip his hand behind my fiancée's neck and pull her close. They broke apart after 5 seconds, maybe 6, and she touched her lips like she was checking if they were still there. I didn't move, didn't drop the glass, didn't shout, didn't cross the room and grab him by his Brooks Brothers collar. I stood there beside the dessert table with my aunt still talking about her cruise to Alaska, nodding at the right moments, smiling when she showed me photos on her phone. My hand was steady. The Merlot didn't ripple. 23 years of friendship, 3 years of planning this wedding, and Marcus had just kissed Simone 6 feet from where our parents were trading stories about our childhoods. The pianist was playing something soft and forgettable, and the room smelled like prime rib and white roses, and I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath my dress shoes. My name is David, and this is my revenge story. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with the city you're watching from. It really helps me bring you more stories. Simone saw me watching in the mirror. Our eyes met in the glass, and something flickered across her face that wasn't quite guilt, wasn't quite fear. She smoothed her champagne-colored dress and walked toward the women's restroom with her sister trailing behind, laughing at something on her phone. Marcus adjusted his tie and headed for the bar, ordered another scotch, shook hands with my uncle. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man who had done this before and knew exactly how much he could get away with. I watched him laugh at something the bartender said, watched him check his Rolex, watched him scan the room with the easy posture of someone who believed he was untouchable. The wedding was in 8 days. We'd sent 400 invitations. The venue was a historic estate in Maryland with gardens that cost more per hour than most people's monthly rent. Simone had spent 11 months choosing flowers, tasting cakes, arguing with her mother about the seating chart. I'd written my vows on a flight back from a consulting job in Denver, 27,000 feet above the ground, trying to find words that matched what I thought we had. Her parents had flown in from Atlanta. My mother had bought a new dress and gotten her hair done at a salon she'd been saving up to visit for 6 months. The photographer was booked, the DJ had our playlist, and the invitations had been printed on Italian paper that cost $4 per card. I set my wine glass down on the white tablecloth and pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the Photos app and scrolled back through 3 years of pictures. Simone and me at her law school graduation, at my promotion dinner, on vacation in Cancun, at my cousin's wedding where Marcus had been there too, standing just outside the frame in half the shots. I looked at her smile in those images, the way she leaned into me, the diamond ring I'd saved 8 months to buy catching the light. Then I opened my text messages and saw the thread with Marcus from this morning. His message telling me he was honored to be my best man, that he couldn't wait to stand beside me while I married the woman of my dreams. The message had 3 exclamation points. The rehearsal dinner had 90 minutes left. My father was about to give a toast. Simone's maid of honor had a speech prepared that she'd been rehearsing for 2 weeks, something about true love and destiny and knowing when you'd found your person. The servers were bringing out chocolate cake with raspberry sauce, and someone had started a countdown to the wedding day that made everyone cheer. I could see the event coordinator checking her clipboard near the kitchen, could see the restaurant manager refilling champagne flutes, could see my mother wiping tears from her eyes while she talked to Simone's mother about grandchildren someday soon. I walked slowly toward the small stage where the microphone stood waiting for the toasts. Each step felt measured, deliberate, like I was approaching something I couldn't come back from. The conversations around me blurred into background noise. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, steady and hard, counting off seconds like a clock running down. Marcus was still at the bar, his back to me, gesturing with his drink while he talked to my groomsmen. Simone had returned from the bathroom, was standing near her bridesmaids, adjusting one of the centerpieces with that particular concentration she used when she was pretending everything was fine. The pianist finished one song and started another. I reached for the microphone stand and felt the cool metal against my palm. The room began to quiet, people turning in their seats, expecting the scheduled toasts to begin. My father caught my eye from across the room and raised his glass, smiling that proud smile I'd seen all my life. Simone's father did the same. Marcus turned from the bar, scotch in hand, and for just a second our eyes met, and I saw something flicker there, some calculation happening behind his expression. I lifted the microphone from its stand and the room went completely silent. All those faces turned toward me, waiting for me to say something beautiful about love and commitment and forever. I didn't speak right away, just stood there holding the microphone, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until people started shifting in their seats and glancing at each other. The spotlight from the small stage washed out everything beyond the first few tables, but I could feel everyone watching, could sense the anticipation building like pressure before a storm. Simone's expression had changed from casual to alert, her body language shifting in that way people do when they realize something's wrong but don't yet know what. Marcus had gone completely still at the bar, his drink halfway to his mouth, frozen mid-gesture like someone had paused a video. I looked down at my phone, still in my left hand, and pulled up the Photos app again. Found the folder I'd created last month when I first started noticing the small inconsistencies, the gaps in her schedule that didn't quite add up, the way Marcus always seemed to know things about Simone's day that she hadn't told me yet. I'd ignored it at first, told myself I was being paranoid, that pre-wedding stress was making me see problems where none existed. But then there was the late night she said she was working on a brief and Marcus posted an Instagram story from a restaurant across town, and in the background of his video, barely visible in the dim lighting, was a woman in a blue dress identical to the one Simone had worn that day. I'd started paying attention after that. Not obsessively, not in a way that consumed my days, but with the quiet focus I used at work when a client's numbers didn't match their story. I noticed that Marcus texted her more than he texted me. I noticed that she'd delete messages sometimes, quickly, when I walked into the room. I noticed that when the three of us were together, there was a rhythm to their conversation that excluded me. Inside jokes that predated our relationship, but somehow felt more intimate than nostalgic. I'd met Simone through Marcus 3 years ago at a networking event. Him introducing us with that big smile and firm handshake, telling me she was brilliant and beautiful and exactly my type. The restaurant manager had started moving toward the stage, probably concerned about the lengthening silence, but I held up one finger and he stopped. I cleared my throat and the microphone amplified the sound, making several people jump. Simone was whispering something to her maid of honor, her face composed but her hands clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles pale. My mother looked confused, glancing between me and my father like she was trying to understand what was happening. The catering staff had paused mid-service, holding trays of cake, uncertain whether to continue or retreat to the kitchen. I thought about the deposit checks. $15,000 for the venue, non-refundable. $8,000 for the catering, already paid. $4,000 for the photographer, contracted and confirmed. The dress Simone had bought cost more than my first car, hanging now in her apartment closet wrapped in white silk. I'd written checks, signed contracts, shaken hands with vendors who all said the same thing about how lucky we were, how perfect we seemed together, how rare it was to see a couple so clearly in love. My savings account had a balance I tried not to look at too often, depleted from deposits and down payments and all the small expenses that accumulated like interest on a debt I hadn't agreed to carry alone. I started speaking. My voice came out steady, controlled, nothing like the chaos I felt building behind my ribs. I told them thank you for coming, told them how much it meant to see everyone gathered here, told them that Simone and I were grateful for their love and support. Standard toast material, the kind of thing people say at these events, and I could see the tension in the room start to ease, people relaxing back into their chairs, picking up their forks to eat the cake that was slowly melting on their plates. Simone's shoulders dropped slightly. Marcus took a sip of his scotch. My father smiled and nodded encouragement. Then I told them I had a video to show. "Something special I'd put together," I said, a little surprised for the bride. The event coordinator moved quickly to set up the projector screen we'd rented for the slideshow that was supposed to happen during the reception, pulling it down from the ceiling while someone dimmed the main lights. Simone looked genuinely surprised, which almost made me laugh. Her mother was already crying again, dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, probably expecting baby photos and romantic montages. Marcus had set his drink down on the bar, and I noticed his hand was gripping the edge of the counter, his posture no longer relaxed. I connected my phone to the projector with the adapter I'd brought specifically for this moment, tested it twice last night in my apartment to make sure everything would work perfectly. The screen lit up white, then blue as my phone's display appeared projected 10 feet high against the wall. I opened the folder I'd labeled Wedding Memories and selected the first video. It was time-stamped 3 months ago. Security footage from the parking garage beneath Marcus's apartment building, grainy but clear enough. The camera angle showed 2 people getting out of a black Audi that I recognized immediately because I'd helped Simone pick it out last year, celebrating her first associate position at the firm. The footage showed them walking to the elevator, showed Marcus's hand on the small of her back, showed them getting into the elevator together at 11:30 on a Thursday night when she'd told me she was working late at the office. I didn't say anything. Just let the video play, 20 seconds of silent footage that said everything that needed saying. The room had gone dead quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, like everyone was holding their breath at once. I could hear someone's phone buzzing, ignored and insistent. I could hear the kitchen staff behind the closed doors, unaware of what was happening out here. I could hear my own breathing, measured and calm, while I queued up the next video and watched Simone's face go from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like relief, like she'd been waiting for this moment and was glad it had finally arrived. The second video was worse. Not because it showed anything explicit, but because it was recent, from 6 days ago, footage I'd pulled from the restaurant security cameras after making a phone call to an old friend who worked in private investigation. He'd taught me some things over drinks one night about how much of our lives gets recorded, how easy it is to request footage if you know who to ask and what reason to give. This video showed Simone and Marcus at a steakhouse in Georgetown, the one with the private booths and dim lighting, sitting close together across a table meant for intimate dinners. Their body language told the whole story, even without sound. The way she leaned in, the way he touched her hand, the way they laughed at something private and looked at each other like they were the only 2 people in the world. I let it play for 30 seconds before switching to the next one. This was daytime, outside Marcus's office building downtown, him meeting her for lunch, kissing her on the cheek in a way that lasted too long to be friendly. Then another, from a coffee shop near her law firm, both of them sitting by the window while rain streaked the glass, their heads close together over a single laptop. I had 12 videos total, spanning 4 months, a timeline of betrayal documented in security footage and phone recordings and screenshots of deleted messages I'd recovered using software that cost me $400 but proved worth every cent. I didn't show them all. Didn't need to. After the 4th video, I stopped the playback and the screen went blue again. The room felt different now. The air thick with shock and disbelief and that particular kind of embarrassment people feel when they witness someone else's private humiliation made public. Simone hadn't moved from her spot near the bridesmaids, hadn't tried to run or hide or explain. She just stood there with her arms at her sides, staring at the screen like she was watching something happen to someone else. Her maid of honor had backed away slightly, creating distance, and I noticed several other bridesmaids doing the same thing, a subtle reorganization of loyalties happening in real time. Marcus had left the bar and was moving toward the exit, but my cousin Raymond was blocking the door, all 6 feet 4 inches of him planted there like a wall. My father stood up from his table, his face unreadable, and for a moment I thought he might tell me to stop, to take this somewhere private, to handle it like men were supposed to handle things, with quiet conversations and closed doors. But he just looked at Simone, then at Marcus, trapped by the exit, then back at me on the stage, and slowly sat back down without saying a word. My mother was crying, but these weren't the happy tears from earlier. These were the kind of tears mothers cry when they realize their sons have been hurt in ways they can't fix, when they understand that the future they'd imagined has just disappeared like smoke. I spoke into the microphone again, my voice still steady, still controlled. I told them that the wedding was canceled. I told them that all vendors would be notified by Monday, that anyone who'd traveled from out of town would receive compensation for their expenses from my account, that I took full responsibility for the wasted time and money and expectations. I told them I was sorry they'd come all this way for nothing, sorry they'd bought gifts and made arrangements and cleared their schedules for an event that would never happen. I didn't apologize for showing the videos, didn't apologize for doing this publicly instead of privately. They deserved to know why their time was being wasted, deserved to understand that this wasn't cold feet or last-minute doubts but something real and deliberate and unforgivable. Simone finally moved. She walked toward the stage, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor in the sudden quiet, and I could see she was trying to compose something to say, trying to find words that might explain or justify or somehow make this less than what it was. But when she got close enough to speak without the microphone, close enough that only I could hear her, she stopped. We stood there looking at each other, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, something that might have been there all along, but I'd been too trusting to notice. It wasn't quite guilt, wasn't quite regret. It was closer to resignation, like she'd known this moment would come eventually and had just been waiting to see when. She asked me how long I'd known. Not, this isn't what it looks like, or let me explain, or any of the things people say when they're caught. Just how long. I told her 3 weeks, which was true, though I'd suspected for longer and had spent those 3 weeks confirming everything, building my case like I was preparing for trial, making sure I had evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. She nodded slowly, like that made sense, like she respected the thoroughness of it. Then she asked what I wanted from her, what I needed her to do now, and that question felt worse than the betrayal somehow, the pragmatic efficiency of it, like we were negotiating the terms of a business dissolution instead of the end of everything we'd planned together. I told her I wanted her to leave. Wanted both of them to leave, actually, and to never contact me again, never show up at places I might be, never try to explain or apologize or make this into something we could eventually laugh about over drinks years from now when the wounds had healed. I wanted them erased from my life completely, the way you delete files from a hard drive and then empty the trash so there's no possibility of recovery. She stood there for a moment longer, and I thought she might argue or cry or make some kind of scene, but she just turned and walked toward the exit where Marcus was still standing, still blocked by Raymond. My cousin looked at me and I nodded, and he stepped aside to let them pass. They left together, of course, side by side through the restaurant doors and out into the October night, and I watched through the window as they stood by her car having what looked like an intense conversation, their breath visible in the cold air, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something in. Then they got into separate cars and drove away in different directions, and I wondered if that was genuine or just for show, if they'd meet up later somewhere private to debrief and strategize and figure out their next move. The door closed behind them, and the noise of the traffic faded, and I was left standing on stage in front of 93 people who had come here expecting a celebration and gotten something else entirely. The restaurant manager appeared at my elbow, polite but firm, asking if we were finished with the event or if I wanted to continue with the scheduled programming. I almost laughed at the question, at the absurdity of imagining everyone going back to their cake and champagne after what they'd just witnessed. But I kept my composure and told him we were done, that I'd settle the bill immediately and add a generous gratuity for the staff's trouble. He nodded and disappeared toward his office, probably grateful to escape the awkward weight that had settled over the room like fog. People were starting to gather their things, whispering to each other, shooting glances my way that ranged from sympathetic to horrified to something that looked almost like admiration. My father reached me first. He didn't hug me or offer condolences or ask if I was okay. He just put his hand on my shoulder, squeezed once, and said he was proud of me for handling it the way I did. His voice was rough, the way it got when he was working through emotions he didn't quite know how to express, and I realized he was angry on my behalf, that quiet, burning anger that men of his generation carried like a coat they never quite took off. He told me Marcus had always seemed too smooth, too practiced, the kind of man who knew exactly what to say and when to say it. He'd never mentioned this before, had welcomed Marcus into our family gatherings and golfed with him and treated him like the friend I'd claimed he was, but apparently he'd been watching the whole time, cataloging reservations he'd never voiced. My mother came next, and she did hug me, hard enough that I could feel her shaking. She didn't say anything about Simone or Marcus or the wedding. She just held on like she was trying to transfer some of her strength through physical contact, like if she squeezed tight enough she could absorb some of the pain I was feeling. When she finally pulled back, her makeup was ruined and her eyes were red, but she managed to smile and told me she'd never liked how Simone corrected my grammar at dinner parties, how she'd made little comments about my clothes or my car or the apartment I'd been so proud to afford on my own. Small things, easily dismissed, but they'd accumulated in my mother's memory like evidence in a trial she'd been building without realizing it. Simone's parents left without speaking to me. Her father wouldn't make eye contact, just gathered his wife and headed for the door with his jaw clenched and his shoulders rigid. Her mother shot me one glance that was pure venom, like somehow I was the villain in this story, like I'd orchestrated the betrayal just to humiliate their daughter in public. I watched them go and felt nothing, no anger or satisfaction or regret, just a hollow kind of numbness that I knew would wear off eventually and leave something worse in its place. Their departure seemed to signal that it was okay for others to leave too, and people started filing out in small groups, some stopping to offer quick words of support, others avoiding me entirely like my situation was contagious. The restaurant bill came to $14,000, including the deposit I'd already paid and the additional charges for the premium wine pairing Simone had insisted on. I signed the receipt without looking at the total too closely, added a 30% tip that made the manager's eyes widen slightly, and handed over my credit card with the same mechanical efficiency I used for all financial transactions that were too large to think about without getting anxious. The card went through. I signed again. The manager thanked me and said something about understanding these things happen, which seemed like a massive understatement, but I appreciated the attempt at normalcy. My phone had been buzzing continuously in my pocket, messages and calls piling up from people who'd heard what happened, either from someone at the dinner or through the rapid-fire social media posts that I knew were already spreading. I pulled it out and saw texts from groomsmen, from college friends, from my aunt in Chicago who'd flown in for the wedding and was now asking if I needed anything. There were 3 missed calls from Marcus and 1 from Simone, plus a text from her that just said, "Please." I deleted the message without reading the rest, blocked both their numbers, and then went through my social media and blocked them there too, cutting off every avenue of communication I could think of in the span of 2 minutes. Raymond found me by the bar, where I was standing alone watching the cleanup crew fold tables and stack chairs with practiced efficiency. He didn't ask if I was okay or offer sympathy or make jokes to lighten the mood. He just stood next to me and ordered 2 whiskeys, neat, and we drank them in silence while the restaurant returned to its normal state around us, all evidence of the rehearsal dinner disappearing like it had never happened. He told me he had the security footage if I ever needed it, that he'd made copies and stored them somewhere safe, and I realized he'd been helping me more than I knew, that he'd probably been the one to position himself at the door before I even asked. We finished our drinks and he offered to drive me home, but I told him I needed to walk, needed the cold October air and the empty streets and the physical act of putting distance between myself and what had just happened. He understood without me having to explain, just nodded and said he'd check on me tomorrow, then left me standing outside the restaurant with my hands in my pockets and my breath fogging in the streetlights. The city was alive around me, cars passing and people laughing from nearby bars and the metro rumbling beneath the sidewalk, all of it continuing on like nothing had changed when everything had. I started walking north, no particular destination in mind, just moving because standing still felt impossible. My phone buzzed again and I checked it without thinking, saw a notification from my bank app showing the transaction for the restaurant bill, saw my checking account balance drop by an amount that would take me months to recover. I thought about the other deposits I'd lose, the other checks I'd written that wouldn't be refunded, the financial hole this canceled wedding would leave me in. Then I thought about the alternative, standing at that altar in 8 days and promising forever to someone who'd already betrayed me, and the money didn't seem to matter quite as much. I walked for 2 hours through neighborhoods that blurred together in the darkness, past row houses with lit windows showing families having normal Friday nights, past corner stores and coffee shops closing up for the evening, past the kind of D.C. streets I'd walked hundreds of times but suddenly felt foreign and strange. My feet hurt in my dress shoes, and my jacket wasn't warm enough for the temperature that kept dropping, but I kept going, kept moving, because stopping meant returning to my apartment where Simone's things were still scattered around. Her toothbrush in the bathroom and her coffee mug in the sink and her law books on the shelf we'd assembled together last spring. My phone died somewhere around DuPont Circle, the battery finally giving out after all those ignored calls and deleted messages, and the sudden silence felt like a kind of relief. No more buzzing, no more notifications, no more people trying to reach me with condolences or questions or theories about what they thought had happened. Just me in the city and the sound of my own footsteps on concrete. I passed the coffee shop where I'd first told Simone I loved her, sitting at a window table while rain drummed against the glass, her hand in mine, and her smile bright with what I'd believed was genuine happiness. That was 14 months ago, and I wondered now if Marcus had already been in the picture then, if I'd been declaring my love to someone who was already calculating how long she could maintain the deception. I ended up at my apartment building after midnight, exhausted and cold and running on nothing but adrenaline and anger that had settled into something harder and more permanent than the initial shock. The security guard nodded at me as I came through the lobby, his expression neutral but his eyes knowing, and I realized word had probably spread through every network I was part of that by tomorrow everyone I knew would have heard some version of what happened. I took the elevator to the 4th floor and stood outside my door for a full minute before I could make myself turn the key, bracing for what I'd find inside. Her things were everywhere, exactly as I'd known they would be. The apartment we'd been planning to give up next month for a bigger place in Arlington, the lease we'd already signed and put deposit on, the future we'd been building that now existed only as a series of canceled contracts and broken promises. I walked through the rooms cataloging what was hers and what was mine, mentally dividing our shared life into component parts that would need to be separated. The framed photo from her graduation on the bookshelf, the yoga mat in the corner, the expensive blender she'd bought for the smoothies she made every morning, the engagement ring sitting in its box on my dresser where I'd left it after she gave it back without me asking, just took it off her finger in the restaurant parking lot and handed it to me like we were settling a debt. I sat on the couch we'd bought together at a furniture store in Virginia, haggling over the price and laughing about our different ideas of what constituted a reasonable amount to spend on seating. It was gray fabric, modern lines, comfortable enough that we'd spent most evenings there watching movies or working on our laptops or just talking about our days. Now it felt like artifact from someone else's life, a relic from a version of myself that no longer existed. I pulled out my dead phone and plugged it into the charger, watched it slowly come back to life, the screen lighting up with a backlog of messages I wasn't ready to read. The first thing I did was open my email and start drafting cancellation notices. The venue first, professional and brief, stating that due to unforeseen circumstances the wedding would not be taking place and requesting information about which deposits were non-refundable and which might be partially recovered. Then the caterer, the photographer, the florist, the DJ, the cake designer, the transportation company we'd hired for shuttling guests from hotels. Each email was a small death, a tiny amputation of the future I'd been planning, and by the time I finished the last one my hands were shaking and my vision was blurred with exhaustion. I thought about calling in sick to work on Monday, taking a few days to process everything, but I knew that would make it worse. That sitting alone in this apartment surrounded by reminders would drive me into the kind of spiral I might not climb out of easily. Work would be better. The routine and structure and the problems that needed solving that had nothing to do with my personal life. I'd learned that during my father's illness 3 years ago, how sometimes the best thing you can do is keep moving, keep functioning, keep showing up, even when everything inside you wants to shut down. So I set my alarm for 6:30 and told myself I'd go in like normal, face whatever conversations came, and deal with it the way I dealt with everything else that was hard. Before I could stop myself, I opened the folder on my laptop where I'd stored all the evidence I'd collected over the past 3 weeks. Not just the videos I'd shown at the dinner, but everything else I'd found. Screenshots of text messages between Simone and Marcus going back 8 months. Phone records showing hundreds of calls and messages I'd never known about. Credit card statements with charges from hotels and restaurants that didn't match the stories she'd told me about her whereabouts. I'd been thorough, almost obsessively so, documenting every inconsistency and saving every piece of proof like I was building a legal case. And now, looking at it all laid out in neat folders with dates and times and locations, I realized I had enough evidence to destroy both of their reputations if I wanted to. Marcus worked at a prestigious consulting firm downtown, the kind of place that valued image and discretion above almost everything else, where a scandal involving an affair with a client's fiancée could end a career before it really started. Simone was a first-year associate at a law firm that prided itself on ethics and integrity, where her reputation was everything and gossip spread like wildfire through the associate ranks. I had the power to make sure everyone in their professional worlds knew exactly what they'd done, to turn their betrayal into the kind of public humiliation that follows people for years. The thought was tempting, viscerally satisfying in a way that scared me slightly, but I closed the laptop without sending anything and told myself I'd decide in the morning when I wasn't running on rage and exhaustion. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams where I was still at the rehearsal dinner but couldn't find the microphone, where I showed the videos but nobody looked at the screen, where Simone and Marcus laughed together while I stood silent and invisible. I woke up at 5:30 feeling worse than when I'd gone to bed, my neck stiff from falling asleep on the couch and my mouth dry from breathing through my mouth all night. The apartment was cold, the heat not scheduled to kick on for another hour, and I lay there watching the ceiling slowly lighten with dawn and tried to remember what normal Saturday mornings used to feel like. My phone showed 63 unread messages. I scrolled through them without opening most, just reading the preview text that appeared on the lock screen. My college roommate asking if the rumors were true. My aunt saying she was praying for me. 3 different groomsmen offering to come over with beer and help me pack up Simone's things. My boss, surprisingly, telling me to take Monday off if I needed it, that he understood these things took time to process. 2 messages from numbers I didn't recognize, probably wedding vendors who'd already heard through their networks and wanted to confirm cancellations. Nothing from Marcus or Simone, but I hadn't expected anything after blocking them, though part of me wondered if they were trying to reach me through other means, creating new numbers or email addresses to get around the barriers I'd built. I made coffee using the French press Simone had bought last Christmas, measuring out the expensive beans she preferred and heating water to the exact temperature she'd taught me was optimal for extraction. The ritual was automatic, muscle memory from hundreds of mornings doing the same thing, and I didn't realize the irony until I was already pouring the first cup. I thought about dumping it out and making a different kind, using my old drip machine and the cheap supermarket grounds I'd bought before I met her, but that felt petty and small in a way I didn't want to be. So I drank her coffee and hated how good it tasted and promised myself I'd buy different beans next week. The shower was hot enough to hurt, steam filling the bathroom until the mirror was completely fogged and I couldn't see my own reflection. I stood under the water longer than necessary, letting it pound against my shoulders and neck, trying to wash away the tension that had settled there overnight. I thought about the gym membership I'd been neglecting, the swimming pool at the community center where I used to go 3 times a week before wedding planning consumed all my free time. Maybe I'd start going again, reclaim some of the routines I'd abandoned when my life became about us instead of me. The thought felt good, felt like a small act of defiance against the future I'd almost locked myself into. By 8 o'clock I was dressed and out the door, heading for the office even though it was Saturday and I wasn't scheduled to be there. The building was mostly empty, just the security guard and a few dedicated analysts who worked weekends to hit their billable hours. I took the elevator to the 7th floor and settled into my cubicle with my laptop and a notepad, pulling up the project I'd been working on before everything fell apart. It was a market analysis for a client in the pharmaceutical industry, dense with data and projections that required the kind of focused attention I couldn't give it right now, but I tried anyway, forcing myself to read the same spreadsheet 3 times before any of the numbers registered. My phone buzzed with a call from Raymond. I answered, and he asked where I was, sounding concerned when I told him I was at the office. He said that was crazy, that I should be home or with family or anywhere but work, but I explained that being here felt better than being surrounded by reminders of what I'd lost. He understood, or at least didn't argue, and instead told me he was handling something that needed handling, that I shouldn't worry about it and should just focus on getting through the day. I didn't ask what he meant, just thanked him and ended the call, trusting that whatever he was doing was coming from a good place even if I didn't understand the specifics. Around noon, I gave up pretending to work and opened my laptop's browser, typed Marcus's name into the search bar along with the name of his firm. His professional profile came up immediately, one of those polished headshots they make you take when you start at a corporate job, him smiling in a gray suit against a neutral background. The biography listed his education, his previous positions, his areas of expertise, all the credentials that were supposed to signal competence and trustworthiness. I read through his LinkedIn profile, looking at his connections and endorsements and the recommendations from colleagues who praised his strategic thinking and client relations skills. 347 connections, including me, until I clicked the remove button and watched our professional network dissolve. Then I searched for Simone, found her law firm profile with a similar headshot, her smile bright and professional and completely at odds with the person I'd discovered her to be. Her biography emphasized her commitment to justice and ethical practice, her dedication to serving clients with integrity and transparency. The words felt like a joke now, a carefully constructed fiction that had nothing to do with reality. I closed the browser and sat staring at the blank screen, wondering how many other people were living double lives behind their professional profiles, how many polished headshots and carefully worded biographies were covering up betrayals and deceptions that would eventually come to light. I spent the rest of Saturday afternoon boxing up Simone's things from my apartment, working with mechanical efficiency that kept me from thinking too hard about what I was doing. Her clothes went into garbage bags, her toiletries into a cardboard box from the recycling room, her books and pictures and random possessions into whatever containers I could find. I wasn't gentle about it, wasn't trying to preserve anything or pack it carefully for transport. I just wanted it gone, wanted every trace of her removed from my space so I could start rebuilding something that was entirely mine. By 6 o'clock, I had everything piled by the door, ready to be picked up or thrown away. I didn't particularly care which. Raymond called again around 7, asked if I'd eaten anything today. I realized I hadn't, that I'd been running on coffee and adrenaline since waking up, and my stomach felt hollow and tight. He showed up 30 minutes later with Chinese takeout and 2 six-packs of beer, let himself in with the spare key I'd given him years ago. We ate in silence for a while, sitting on the couch with cartons of lo mein and fried rice spread across the coffee table, the television playing something neither of us was watching. He didn't ask how I was feeling or try to make conversation about what happened, just ate his food and drank his beer and provided the kind of presence that didn't require words. Eventually, he told me what he'd been handling earlier. He'd gone to Marcus's apartment building, waited in the parking garage until Marcus came out, and had what he called a conversation. I didn't ask for details about what was said or how it was said, but Raymond's knuckles were slightly swollen and he was moving his right shoulder carefully, and I understood enough. He said Marcus had been receptive to the main points of the discussion, particularly the point about staying far away from me and never attempting contact again. I should have told him not to do things like that violence wasn't the answer and we were better than that, but instead I just nodded and thanked him and felt something that might have been gratitude mixed with shame that I hadn't handled it myself. We finished the food and worked through most of the beer, and Raymond told me about his own divorce 3 years ago, a story I'd heard parts of but never the whole thing. He talked about the rage he'd felt, the sleepless nights, the way his whole identity had been tied up in being married and how lost he'd felt when that ended. He said the anger was useful for a while, that it kept him moving when everything else told him to give up, but that eventually he'd had to let it go or it would have consumed him completely. He told me I'd know when that time came, when holding on to the fury cost more than it was worth, and until then it was okay to feel whatever I needed to feel. After he left, I sat alone in the apartment that felt bigger and emptier without Simone's things filling the corners. I pulled out my laptop again and opened the folder with all the evidence I'd collected. scrolled through the screenshots and videos and documents that proved exactly what had happened. I thought about what I could do with this information, the damage I could cause if I wanted revenge beyond just exposing them at the rehearsal dinner. Their jobs, their reputations, their futures in their respective industries, all of it was vulnerable if I decided to make the right calls to the right people. The power of it was intoxicating, dangerous, the kind of weapon that could destroy lives if I chose to use it. But something Raymond said stuck with me, about how holding on to rage eventually consumes you, about how revenge has diminishing returns after a certain point. I'd already exposed them publicly, already made sure everyone in our social circle knew what they'd done. Taking it further, targeting their careers and their professional lives, felt like it would cost me more than it would cost them. It would mean spending more time thinking about them, more energy focused on destruction instead of rebuilding, more of my life wasted on people who'd already taken too much. So I closed the laptop again and made myself a promise that I'd sit with this decision for a week before doing anything else, that I'd give myself time to think clearly before deploying weapons I couldn't take back. Sunday morning, I woke up to a text from my mother asking if I wanted to come to church with her. I hadn't been in months, maybe longer, and the thought of sitting through a service where everyone would look at me with pity and whisper about what happened made my skin crawl. But I texted back yes anyway, because staying alone in my apartment felt worse than facing the congregation, and because my mother's voice on the phone last night had sounded fragile in a way that made me want to do something, anything, to make her feel better. I showered and put on a suit and drove to the church I'd grown up in, the one with the red doors and the stained glass windows and the pastor who'd known me since I was 6 years old. The church was packed like it always was on Sunday mornings. Families filling the pews in their good clothes, the choir warming up in their robes, the smell of coffee and donuts from the fellowship hall mixing with furniture polish and old hymnals. I walked in with my mother and immediately felt the weight of attention shift toward us, heads turning and conversations pausing as people registered my presence. My mother held my arm like she was steadying herself or steadying me. I couldn't tell which. And we made our way to our usual pew 3 rows from the front where my family had sat for 30 years. People nodded as we passed, some offering small smiles of sympathy, others looking away quickly like they didn't know what expression to wear. Pastor Williams was setting up at the pulpit when he saw me, and something crossed his face that looked like relief mixed with concern. He'd been scheduled to perform the wedding ceremony next Saturday, had met with Simone and me 4 times over the past 2 months to do premarital counseling that now seemed like a waste of everyone's time. He'd talked to us about communication and commitment and building a marriage on a foundation of faith and honesty, and I wondered what he thought about the irony of those conversations now. After the service started, after the hymns and announcements and the collection plate made its rounds, he stood at the pulpit and looked directly at me before beginning his sermon. He talked about betrayal, not in abstract theological terms, but in the concrete language of human experience, about what it means when people we trust violate that trust, about the anger and grief and confusion that follows. He talked about Joseph and his brothers, about David and Absalom, about Peter denying Christ 3 times before the rooster crowed. He talked about how the Bible was full of stories about betrayal, because betrayal was woven into the human experience, because everyone in that room had either been betrayed, or would be betrayed, or had betrayed someone themselves. His voice was calm but firm, and I realized he was preaching this sermon specifically for me, reshaping whatever he'd planned to address what had happened. He talked about revenge too, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about how the Bible commanded us to leave retribution to God because humans couldn't be trusted with it. He quoted Romans, something about not repaying evil for evil, about leaving room for God's wrath instead of taking matters into our own hands. Part of me wanted to stand up and argue, to say that public exposure wasn't vengeance but honesty, that showing people the truth about who they'd welcomed into their lives wasn't revenge but protection. But I stayed seated and listened, because underneath my defensiveness I knew he was right, knew that the folder full of evidence on my laptop represented a choice between moving forward and staying locked in the past. After the service ended, people approached me cautiously like I was something fragile that might shatter if handled wrong. Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught my Sunday school class when I was 8, hugged me without saying anything. Deacon Morris shook my hand and told me he was proud of how I'd handled myself, though I wasn't sure if he meant at the rehearsal dinner or in general. Several people mentioned they'd already heard what happened, news traveling through the church network with the speed that only church gossip could achieve, and they wanted me to know they were praying for me. I thanked them mechanically, accepted their sympathy without really feeling it, and tried to smile enough to make my mother feel like bringing me here had been the right decision. Pastor Williams caught me in the parking lot before I could leave, asked if I had a few minutes to talk. We sat in his office while my mother waited in the car, the small room lined with books and degrees and pictures of his own family looking happy and intact. He didn't waste time with small talk or unnecessary preamble, just asked me how I was really doing underneath the composure I was showing everyone else. I told him I was angry, which he probably knew, and that I was trying to figure out what to do with that anger before it did something I'd regret. He nodded like he'd expected that answer, like he'd counseled enough people through enough crises to recognize the pattern. He asked if I'd thought about forgiveness, and I almost laughed at the question because forgiveness felt impossible right now, felt like something only saints or fools attempted. But he explained he wasn't talking about reconciliation or pretending it didn't happen or welcoming them back into my life. He was talking about releasing the hold their actions had on my future, about choosing not to let their betrayal define the rest of my story. He said unforgiveness was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die, a metaphor I'd heard before but never really understood until now, when I could feel the toxicity of my own rage starting to affect everything I touched. He told me about his own experience with betrayal, a story I'd never heard before about a business partner who'd stolen money and destroyed his first attempt at entrepreneurship before he went to seminary. He said he'd spent 2 years planning revenge, documenting everything, building a case that would have sent the guy to prison and ruined him completely. But in the end, he'd walked away without doing anything. Not because the guy deserved mercy, but because carrying around that weight was destroying him more than any revenge could destroy his former partner. He said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, harder than forgiving, and that it still bothered him sometimes when he let himself think about it. I left the church without making any promises about forgiveness or letting go, but with something shifting slightly in how I thought about the evidence folder and what I planned to do with it. My mother didn't ask what Pastor Williams and I talked about, just squeezed my hand when I got back in the car and suggested we get lunch somewhere. Her treat. We went to a diner she liked, ordered breakfast food even though it was almost noon, and sat across from each other in a booth by the window while she told me stories about my father, about the early years of their marriage when money was tight and they fought about stupid things and wondered if they'd made a mistake. She said every marriage had moments of doubt, but that the difference between marriages that lasted and marriages that ended was whether both people were committed to working through those moments together. Monday morning, I went back to work like I'd planned, dressed in my best suit and carrying my leather briefcase like armor against the conversations I knew were coming. The office felt different somehow, people glancing at me and then quickly away, the normal morning chatter quieter when I walked past. My desk was exactly as I'd left it Friday afternoon, before the rehearsal dinner, before everything changed, and I sat down in my chair and booted up my computer with the same motions I'd performed 1,000 times. Email notifications appeared on my screen showing messages from vendors confirming cancellations, each one a small reminder of the future that no longer existed. My boss called me into his office before lunch, closed the door, and gestured for me to sit. I expected the conversation to be about my personal situation, about whether I could handle my workload or needed time off, but instead he slid a folder across his desk and told me about a new client. A tech startup in Baltimore looking for market analysis and growth strategy, exactly the kind of project I specialized in, complex enough to require real focus but not so urgent that I couldn't take my time getting it right. He said he thought I could use something to concentrate on, something that had nothing to do with my personal life. And he was right, even though I didn't want to admit it. I spent the afternoon diving into research about the tech industry in Maryland, reading reports and analyzing data and building the kind of comprehensive picture that consulting firms charged premium rates to deliver. The work was absorbing in the way I needed it to be, requiring enough mental energy that I couldn't think about Simone or Marcus or wedding cancellations while I was doing it. By 5 o'clock, I had 20 pages of notes and the skeleton of a strategy that might actually help this company succeed, and I felt something that almost resembled normal satisfaction at having produced good work. It wasn't happiness, wasn't even close, but it was better than the hollow numbness I'd been carrying around. That evening, I finally dealt with Simone's belongings that were still piled by my apartment door. I'd texted her sister Saturday night, told her everything needed to be picked up by Monday, or I was donating it all to Goodwill. She'd responded with a cold message saying she'd handle it, and true to her word, she showed up at 6 with 2 friends and a borrowed van. I let them in without speaking, gestured to the boxes and bags, and retreated to my bedroom while they loaded everything up. I heard them whispering, heard my name mentioned a few times along with Marcus's, heard one of them say something about how Simone was devastated and didn't know what to do. I stayed in my room until they left, listening to the door close behind them with a finality that felt like ending a chapter. The apartment was mine again, empty of her presence except for the ghost impressions where her things had been, the bathroom counter where her makeup used to sit, the closet where her clothes had hung, the nightstand on what had been her side of the bed. I walked through the rooms touching these empty spaces like I was erasing her completely, reclaiming territory that had been temporarily occupied. Then I did something I hadn't planned, something that felt both destructive and necessary. I rearranged all the furniture, moved the couch to a different wall, shifted the bed to face another direction, reorganized the kitchen cabinet so nothing was where it used to be. By midnight, the apartment looked completely different, unfamiliar enough that it didn't remind me of the life I'd been living last week. Tuesday brought more cancellation confirmations and a few small victories. The photographer agreed to refund half the deposit since she could potentially book another wedding for that date. The florist kept everything but seemed genuinely sympathetic about it. The venue was inflexible, as I'd expected, but the event coordinator sent a personal note saying she admired how I'd handled the situation and hoped I'd consider them for future events, which almost made me laugh. Future events. Like I'd ever want to plan a wedding again. Like I could imagine trusting someone enough to go through this process another time. My phone rang. Wednesday afternoon with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another vendor or someone calling about the wedding, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was professional, female, introducing herself as Linda Chen from Marcus's consulting firm. She said she was calling to verify some information that had come to her attention, that there had been allegations about Marcus's conduct, and she wanted to hear my side of the story. I felt my pulse quicken, realized that someone had contacted his employer, and I had a pretty good idea who. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about, that I had no interest in discussing Marcus or his conduct with anyone from his firm. She pressed gently, said that if there was misconduct, it was important for the firm to know, that they took these matters seriously and wanted to ensure all employees maintained professional standards. I asked her directly if someone had filed a complaint, and after a pause she admitted that they'd received an anonymous tip about inappropriate behavior with a client's fiancé. Raymond, I thought. Or maybe one of my other groomsmen taking matters into their own hands, trying to get revenge on my behalf without asking permission. I could have confirmed everything right then, could have told her about the affair, sent her the evidence folder, watched Marcus's career implode the way mine almost had. The temptation was real, visceral, a chance to hurt him the way he'd hurt me. But I thought about Pastor William's sermon, about the difference between justice and vengeance, about the cost of carrying rage forward instead of leaving it behind. So I told Linda Chen that I had nothing to say about Marcus's professional conduct, that whatever issues existed between us were personal and I didn't want them affecting his career. She sounded surprised, maybe disappointed, and thanked me for my time before ending the call. I sat at my desk after the call ended, staring at my computer screen without seeing it, wondering if I'd just made a mistake or done the right thing for the wrong reasons. Part of me wanted to call her back, to send everything I had and watch the consequences unfold. But another part, the part that had been listening to my mother and Pastor Williams and my own exhaustion, knew that involving myself in destroying Marcus's career would only extend this nightmare. would keep me connected to him and Simone and the wedding that didn't happen when what I really needed was distance and separation and the chance to build something new. That night, I opened the evidence folder one last time, scrolled through all the videos and screenshots and documents I'd collected so carefully. Then I selected everything, dragged it to the trash, and emptied it permanently, watching the files disappear into digital oblivion. It felt reckless and final and strangely liberating, like cutting the last rope tying me to a boat that was already sinking. I had the copies Raymond made if I ever needed proof for some reason, but having it on my personal computer felt like keeping poison in my medicine cabinet, too easy to reach for in a moment of weakness. Better to remove the temptation entirely and force myself to move forward instead of looking back. 3 weeks after the rehearsal dinner that became a public execution, I started noticing changes in how people treated me. The initial sympathy had faded into something more complicated, a mix of respect and cautious distance, like I'd proven myself capable of something they weren't sure they wanted to be around. Coworkers still asked how I was doing, but with less frequency, moving on to other office gossip and personal dramas. Friends stopped checking in daily, assuming I'd reached out if I needed something. The attention that had felt suffocating at first began to dissipate, leaving me with the privacy I'd wanted and the loneliness I hadn't anticipated. I fell into new routines that had nothing to do with the old ones. Started swimming again at the community center, showing up at 6 in the morning before work to swim laps until my arms burned and my mind went blank. The pool was always empty that early except for a few dedicated regulars who nodded at me but never made conversation, which was exactly what I needed. The physical exhaustion helped me sleep better at night, helped quiet the thoughts that still sometimes spiraled when I let them. I'd swim for 45 minutes and then sit in the sauna, letting the heat work out the tension in my shoulders before showering and heading to work feeling almost normal. The tech startup project was going well, better than I'd expected. I'd presented my initial findings to the client and they'd been impressed enough to extend the contract, asking for a full implementation strategy and ongoing consulting support. It meant more hours and more responsibility, but also more money that would help offset the financial damage from the canceled wedding. My boss noticed the quality of the work, mentioned it during our weekly check-in, and I realized I'd been performing at a higher level than usual, channeling everything I felt into professional excellence because it was the one area of my life I could still control completely. I ran into Simone's best friend at the grocery store on a Saturday afternoon, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee at the same moment. She pulled her hand back like I'd burned her, looked at me with something between pity and disgust, and said she couldn't believe I'd humiliated Simone like that in front of everyone. I stood there holding my coffee, waiting for the anger to rise, but instead I just felt tired. I told her I was sorry she saw it that way, that from my perspective I'd simply shown people the truth about who they'd been celebrating. She said there were better ways to handle these things, more mature ways, and I agreed that probably there were, but I didn't regret the choice I'd made. She told me Simone was devastated, had barely left her apartment in weeks, was seeing a therapist and talking about moving to a different city to escape the gossip and judgment. Part of me felt satisfaction at hearing that, the vindictive part that still wanted her to suffer the way I'd suffered, but mostly I just felt nothing, a blank space where strong emotions used to be. I asked about Marcus and she got defensive, said he was dealing with his own consequences, that his firm had put him on a performance improvement plan after rumors spread about the affair. I wondered if that had come from Raymond's anonymous tip or from office gossip that had made its way through professional networks, but I didn't ask for details. We stood there in the coffee aisle for another minute, neither of us knowing how to end the conversation, before she finally said she hoped I'd find peace or happiness or whatever I was looking for. It sounded sincere despite everything, and I thanked her and meant it, then watched her walk away with her basket half full of organic produce and wine. I finished my shopping and drove home and didn't think about the encounter again until later that night when I was lying in bed unable to sleep, wondering if Simone really was devastated, or if that was just what her friends were saying to make her seem sympathetic instead of guilty. My mother called Sunday morning to invite me to lunch after church, and I accepted even though I'd been skipping services the past couple weeks. Church felt too public still, too many people wanting to talk about how I was doing, too many prayers offered on my behalf that made me feel like a charity case. But I showed up anyway because my mother's voice had that quality that meant she needed this more than I did. That seeing me in person and making sure I was eating properly was her way of processing what had happened to her son. We sat in the same diner as before, ordered the same breakfast food, and she told me about the church ladies who kept asking about me with that particular tone of concern that was really just nosiness disguised as care. She said, "Mrs." Patterson had mentioned seeing Marcus at a different church across town, that he'd apparently left our congregation either from shame or wisdom. She wasn't sure which. She said several people had asked if I was dating anyone yet, which seemed absurdly premature, but apparently 3 weeks was long enough in their minds for me to have moved on completely. I told her I wasn't ready to think about dating, wasn't sure I'd ever be ready to trust someone that way again, and she nodded but didn't look convinced. She said, time changes things, that wounds heal even when we think they won't, that someday I'd meet someone who made me want to try again. I didn't argue with her, but I didn't believe it either. Toward the end of lunch, she asked me something that surprised me. She asked if I'd forgiven them yet, Simone and Marcus, not for their sake, but for mine. I told her honestly that I hadn't, that forgiveness still felt impossible, but that I'd stopped actively hating them, which seemed like progress. She said that was a start, that forgiveness was a process, not an event, that it happened gradually over time if you let it. I thought about the evidence folder I'd deleted, about the phone call with Marcus's firm where I'd declined to destroy his career, about the small choices I'd been making toward letting go instead of holding on. Maybe those were steps toward forgiveness even if they didn't feel like it yet. A month after everything fell apart, I got an unexpected email from the venue where the wedding was supposed to happen. They'd had a last-minute cancellation for a corporate event in December, and wondered if I'd be interested in reclaiming some of my deposit by allowing them to apply it toward a different type of booking. It was a strange offer, bureaucratic and impersonal, but it made me think about that space and what it meant now. I'd toured it with Simone last January, both of us walking through the gardens in winter talking about how beautiful they'd look in October with fall colors. She'd loved the ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and hardwood floors, had already imagined where the band would set up and how the tables would be arranged. I declined the venue's offer, but the email stayed with me for days, a reminder that the wedding had been real even if the relationship wasn't, that all those plans and deposits and contracts represented something I'd wanted genuinely at the time. I'd been ready to marry her, ready to promise forever, ready to build a life that included her in every part. The betrayal hurt worse because of how real my commitment had been, how thoroughly I'd believed in what we were creating together. And underneath the anger and disappointment was something closer to grief, mourning not just the relationship, but the version of myself who'd been naive enough to trust so completely. Work became my anchor through December. The tech startup contract expanded again. The founders impressed enough with my strategy to bring me in for weekly meetings and make me a permanent consultant on retainer. It meant stability and income, and the kind of professional validation that helped fill some of the holes in my confidence. I was good at this work, good at seeing patterns and building strategies and helping companies navigate growth. Whatever else had fallen apart in my personal life, my professional abilities remained intact, and there was comfort in that consistency. I spent Thanksgiving with my family, my first major holiday as a single man after 3 years of couple-oriented celebrations. My aunt brought her new boyfriend and my cousin brought his wife and their 2 kids, and I was acutely aware of being the only adult there without a partner. My mother tried to deflect attention from that fact by talking about my consulting success and the raise I'd gotten, but I could see the pity in people's eyes when they thought I wasn't looking. My father pulled me aside after dinner and told me he'd been where I was, years before he met my mother, after a relationship ended badly and he thought he'd never trust anyone again. He said survival was enough for now, that I didn't need to be happy or healed yet, just needed to keep showing up until eventually showing up didn't feel so hard. December brought a different kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from seeing Christmas decorations and holiday parties and couple-themed commercials everywhere I looked. I'd planned to spend this December preparing for a honeymoon in the Bahamas, for starting a marriage, for all the traditions we'd talked about creating together. Instead, I worked late most nights, avoiding my empty apartment and the seasonal cheer that felt hollow without someone to share it with. My co-workers invited me to their holiday parties, and I went to a few, nursing drinks in corners while watching other people celebrate with their partners and families. I saw Marcus's car outside a bar in Georgetown one Friday night in mid-December, recognized the custom rims and vanity plate he'd been so proud of. I almost kept driving, but something made me pull over, made me walk into that bar and find him sitting alone at a table in the back. He saw me approaching, and something crossed his face that might have been fear or guilt or resignation. I sat down across from him without asking permission, without planning what I was going to say, just needing to look him in the eye and try to understand how someone I'd trusted for 23 years could do what he'd done. We sat in silence for a long minute before he started talking. He didn't apologize, didn't try to justify it, just told me the truth in a flat voice like he was confessing to a priest. He said it started 8 months before the wedding, at a work event where Simone showed up to support me, and he'd ended up talking to her at the bar while I was networking. He said there was chemistry immediately, something neither of them planned or expected, and they'd tried to ignore it for weeks before finally giving in. He said it wasn't about me, wasn't because I'd done anything wrong or wasn't enough for her. It was just something that happened between them, a connection they couldn't resist even though they both knew it was wrong. He told me they'd tried to end it multiple times, that they'd have long conversations about how they needed to stop before someone got hurt, but then they'd see each other again and fall back into the same patterns. He said the hardest part was being my best man, standing beside me during wedding planning while sleeping with my fiancée, maintaining the friendship while betraying it completely. He said he'd convinced himself that maybe I'd never find out, that maybe they could end it before the wedding, and I'd marry Simone and be happy, and he'd just carry the guilt privately. But then the wedding got closer, and Simone started talking about how she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't marry me while being in love with him, and that's when he knew it was going to explode somehow. I listened to all of it without interrupting, without reacting, just watching him talk and feeling strangely detached from the words. When he finally stopped, asked if I had anything to say, I told him I appreciated the honesty, even if it didn't change anything. I told him we'd never be friends again, that I couldn't carry a relationship with someone who'd proven themselves capable of that level of deception. He nodded like he'd expected that, said he understood, and didn't blame me. Then I stood up and walked out of the bar, left him sitting there with his half-finished beer and his confessions, and drove home feeling somehow lighter even though nothing had been resolved. Christmas came and went in a blur of family obligations and forced cheer. I bought presents for my parents and cousins, showed up for church services and dinner gatherings, smiled when appropriate, and laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny. Everyone was careful around me, avoiding mentions of relationships or weddings or future plans, creating awkward silences where normal conversation should have been. I appreciated the effort but found it exhausting, all that emotional labor from people trying not to remind me of what I'd lost while their very carefulness made it impossible to forget. New Year's Eve. I spent alone in my apartment, deliberately avoiding parties and invitations and the forced optimism of a fresh start. I wasn't ready for fresh starts or new chapters or any of the metaphors people use to make endings feel like beginnings. I was still processing the old chapter, still working through the implications of what had happened and what it meant for how I understood myself and relationships and trust. So I ordered pizza and watched a movie marathon and let midnight pass without fanfare, without resolutions or champagne or counting down to anything. It felt honest in a way that celebrating would have felt hollow. January brought a cold snap that froze the Potomac and made the morning swim sessions brutal but necessary. I'd become addicted to the routine, to the physical punishment of cold water and exhausting laps, to the clarity that came from pushing my body to its limits. The other regulars at the pool had started nodding hello, occasionally sharing the lane when it got crowded, existing in that comfortable space of familiar strangers who shared a ritual without needing to discuss it. One of them, a woman maybe 10 years older than me, mentioned after a particularly hard session that she'd been swimming through her own divorce, that the water helped more than therapy sometimes. We started talking occasionally between laps, brief conversations about swimming technique and water temperature that gradually expanded to include other topics. Her name was Angela, and she worked in nonprofit management and had been swimming at this pool for 5 years. She didn't ask about my story, and I didn't offer it, and there was something refreshing about that anonymity, about being just another swimmer instead of the guy who exposed his fiancée's affair at the rehearsal dinner. We grabbed coffee once after a session, talked about work and family and the books we were reading. Normal conversation between two people who had no history and no expectations. It wasn't romantic, wasn't heading anywhere beyond friendship, but it reminded me that I could still connect with people, still have conversations that didn't revolve around my failed relationship. Angela mentioned a professional networking event her organization was hosting, said I should come if I was interested in meeting people in the nonprofit sector. I went mostly because I had nothing else to do that Thursday night. Showed up in business casual to a hotel conference room filled with professionals drinking wine and exchanging business cards. I talked to maybe a dozen people about consulting and strategy and market analysis, and somewhere in those conversations I realized I was functioning normally again, engaging with the world beyond the narrow focus of work and recovery. One of the people I met that night was a program director for an education nonprofit looking for help with their expansion strategy. We talked for 20 minutes about their mission and challenges, and by the end of the conversation she was asking if I'd be interested in doing some consulting work for them. I gave her my card and told her to email me, then filed the conversation away as a pleasant interaction that probably wouldn't lead anywhere. But she emailed the next day with a formal proposal and a budget that was surprisingly generous, and within a week I'd taken on my second major client with work that actually meant something beyond corporate profits. February was lighter somehow. Winter still cold and gray, but the days getting incrementally longer. Light staying later and arriving earlier. I'd been single for 3 months, which felt both like forever and like no time at all depending on when you asked me. The acute pain had faded into something duller and more manageable. Background noise instead of overwhelming static. I still thought about Simone and Marcus occasionally, usually when something triggered a memory or when I saw couples doing things we used to do. But the thoughts no longer derailed my entire day, no longer sent me spiraling into anger or depression or obsessive analysis of what went wrong. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Simone had moved to Chicago, taken a position with a different law firm, and left D.C. completely. Part of me was relieved to know she was gone, that I wouldn't risk running into her at restaurants or events, that the city felt more fully mine now without her presence. I heard nothing about Marcus and didn't ask, content to let him exist in whatever life he was building without any intersection with mine. The distance felt good, felt like healing even if I wasn't sure I'd call it that yet. My mother stopped asking if I was dating, stopped making comments about getting back out there, or not letting one bad experience ruin my faith in relationships. Instead, she just called weekly to check in, to tell me about church gossip and family news and the mundane details of her life that had nothing to do with my romantic status. I appreciated the shift, the recognition that I was okay being alone for now, that recovery didn't require immediately replacing what I'd lost. Some conversations we didn't even mention the canceled wedding at all, just talked like we used to before my life became defined by relationship drama and public heartbreak. Spring arrived tentatively in March, cherry blossoms appearing along the tidal basin and tourists flooding the city for their annual pilgrimage. I took a Saturday morning to walk through the festival crowds, something I hadn't done in years because Simone had hated the chaos and the crowds. But alone, I found it peaceful in a strange way. All these people celebrating something beautiful and temporary, taking pictures and making memories that would fade like the blossoms themselves. I stood by the water watching petals fall and thought about impermanence, about how nothing lasts forever no matter how solid it seems, and felt something close to acceptance settling into the places where anger used to live. The education nonprofit project had expanded beyond anything I'd anticipated, turning into a full partnership where I was helping them develop programs across 3 states. The work was challenging and meaningful, using my skills to create opportunities for kids who needed them instead of helping corporations maximize profits. My boss at the consulting firm noticed the shift in my focus, mentioned during a review that I seemed more engaged with nonprofit work than corporate contracts. He wasn't wrong, and when he asked if I'd considered transitioning fully into that sector, I realized I had been considering it without consciously acknowledging it. The idea of leaving the firm felt both terrifying and exciting. A bigger life change than I was ready to make, but one that wouldn't stop presenting itself. I ran into Raymond at a Wizards game in late March, both of us there with different groups of friends, and we grabbed beers during halftime to catch up. He looked at me carefully, the way he had been doing since the rehearsal dinner, trying to gauge my state without asking directly. I told him I was good, meant it more than I had the previous times I'd said it, and he seemed to believe me. He mentioned he'd seen Marcus's LinkedIn profile, noticed he'd left his consulting firm and moved to a company in Atlanta. The geographic distance felt right somehow, all of us scattering to different cities and different lives. The past staying in D.C. where it belonged. We talked about the phone call from Marcus's firm, the one where I'd declined to provide evidence that could have destroyed his career. Raymond said he still thought I should have taken that opportunity, that Marcus deserved every consequence he got and more. But I explained what Pastor Williams had said about the cost of carrying rage, about how revenge had diminishing returns after a certain point. Raymond didn't fully agree, but he respected it, said he was proud of me either way for handling everything the way I did. We finished our beers and returned to our seats, and I felt grateful for friends who stood by you even when they disagreed with your choices, who showed up when things fell apart and stayed after the crisis passed. April brought an unexpected letter from Simone, forwarded from my old apartment to my new one across town. I'd moved in March, needing a fresh start in a space that held no memories of her, a one-bedroom in Adams Morgan with exposed brick and tall windows that let in morning light. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I could make myself open it, uncertain what I'd find inside and whether I wanted to engage with whatever she had to say. When I finally read it, late on a Thursday night after too much wine, I found 3 pages of careful handwriting explaining things I hadn't asked to understand. She wrote about the guilt she'd carried through our relationship, about knowing what she was doing was wrong but feeling unable to stop it. She wrote about falling in love with Marcus and trying not to, about the conversations they'd had about ending it and the failures of will that followed. She wrote about the rehearsal dinner and how seeing those videos felt like relief mixed with horror. Relief that the secret was finally out and horror at the public nature of the exposure. She wrote about therapy and forgiveness and trying to understand herself well enough to never do something like this again. She wrote that she didn't expect me to forgive her or respond to the letter, but that she needed to say these things anyway as part of her own healing process. I read it twice and then put it in a drawer, neither responding nor destroying it, just filing it away as part of the historical record of what happened. Her explanations didn't change anything, didn't make the betrayal hurt less or justify what she'd done, but they did make her more human somehow, less the villain I'd constructed and more a flawed person who'd made terrible choices. I thought about writing back, about telling her I was working toward forgiveness even if I wasn't there yet, but decided against it. Some doors needed to stay closed for both people to move forward, and our door had been closed since that night at the rehearsal dinner. May was gorgeous, the city coming alive with green and warmth after the long winter. I started running in addition to swimming, early morning routes through Rock Creek Park that left me exhausted and clear-headed. Angela from the pool had become a genuine friend, someone I grabbed lunch with occasionally and who introduced me to her network of nonprofit professionals. Through her, I met more people doing meaningful work, attended fundraisers and panel discussions and community events that had nothing to do with corporate consulting. My life was expanding in directions I hadn't planned, growing into spaces I didn't know existed, and I felt myself changing in ways that were both subtle and profound. The 6-month mark came in early May, half a year since the rehearsal dinner that should have been followed by a wedding. I'd expected the anniversary to hit hard, to trigger some kind of emotional regression or renewed anger, but instead, I just felt quiet gratitude for everything I'd gained by losing what I thought I wanted. I was in better shape physically than I'd been in years. I was doing work that mattered instead of just work that paid well. I had friendships that were deeper and more authentic than the ones I'd maintained while focused primarily on my relationship with Simone. I had learned things about myself, and about trust, and about resilience that I never would have discovered if everything had gone according to plan. My mother noticed the change when I came over for Sunday dinner in mid-May, commented that I seemed lighter somehow, more present than I'd been in months. I told her about the nonprofit work and the running and the new apartment, all the ways I was building a life that was entirely mine instead of ours. She smiled and said something about God closing doors and opening windows, a cliché that annoyed me slightly but also resonated in ways I wasn't ready to admit. Maybe there was something to the idea that painful endings created space for better beginnings, that loss forced growth that comfort never would have required. June arrived with heat and humidity that made the morning runs harder but somehow more satisfying, sweat and effort translating directly into visible results. I'd lost 15 pounds since January, gained muscle definition I hadn't had since college, and felt strong in ways that went beyond physical fitness. The swimming and running had become meditation as much as exercise. Time alone with my thoughts where I could process everything without the noise of other people's opinions or expectations. I'd started journaling too, writing down thoughts and feelings I didn't want to say out loud, tracking my own evolution from devastated to functional to something that might eventually become happy. The consulting firm offered me a promotion in early June, a senior analyst position with a significant raise and more responsibility. It was everything I'd been working toward before the canceled wedding, the kind of career advancement that should have felt like victory. But when I sat in my boss's office looking at the offer letter, all I could think about was the education nonprofit and the kids whose lives were changing because of the programs we were building. I asked for a week to consider it, went home and made lists of pros and cons, talked to my father about career decisions and long-term planning. In the end, I turned down the promotion and gave my notice, deciding to go independent and focus exclusively on nonprofit consulting. My boss was surprised but supportive, said he'd expected something like this based on where my passion had been lately. He offered to keep me on as a contractor for specific projects, maintaining the relationship while giving me freedom to pursue the work I cared about. We shook hands and I cleaned out my desk, boxing up 3 years of accumulated office supplies and personal items, and walked out of that building feeling terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. I'd just walked away from stability and a clear career path to chase something less certain but more meaningful, and the risk felt appropriate somehow, felt like the kind of bold move that the old version of me never would have made. Angela helped me set up my independent practice, introducing me to nonprofit directors and foundation leaders who needed exactly the kind of strategic support I could provide. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 clients and a pipeline of potential projects that would keep me busy through the end of the year. The money wasn't as guaranteed as a corporate salary, but it was enough, and the work filled something in me that corporate consulting never had. I was using the same skills but directing them toward missions I believed in, helping organizations that were genuinely trying to make the world better instead of just more profitable. I took a weekend trip to Virginia Beach in late June, my first vacation since the canceled honeymoon to the Bahamas. I went alone, deliberately, wanting to prove to myself that I could enjoy travel without needing someone else to validate the experience. I swam in the ocean and read books on the beach and ate at restaurants by myself without feeling self-conscious about being the lone diner. There was freedom in that solitude, in making decisions based solely on what I wanted without negotiating or compromising or considering someone else's preferences. I watched couples walk by holding hands and felt nothing, no envy or bitterness or longing, just neutral observation that they were living their story and I was living mine. July brought an invitation to Angela's birthday party, a backyard barbecue with her close friends and colleagues. I almost declined, still uncomfortable with social events that weren't work-related, but she'd been a good friend during my rebuilding process and I wanted to show up for her the way she'd shown up for me. The party was casual and warm, people laughing and drinking beer and playing cornhole in the fading summer light. Angela introduced me around and I found myself in conversations that flowed easily, talking about nonprofit work and city politics and summer plans without anyone asking about my relationship status or mentioning the canceled wedding that had defined me for so long. There was a woman at the party, a friend of Angela's from graduate school, who smiled at me across the yard and eventually made her way over to introduce herself. Her name was Jennifer, and she worked in public health and had a laugh that was genuine and unself-conscious. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about her work and mine, about the challenges of nonprofit funding and the satisfactions of mission-driven work, and it was easy in a way that conversation hadn't been with anyone in a long time. When she asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, I said yes without overthinking it, without calculating risks or projecting futures, just accepting an invitation from someone interesting who seemed to enjoy talking to me. We met for coffee the following Tuesday, a casual midday break between meetings that stretched into 2 hours of conversation that ranged from professional to personal without ever feeling forced. Jennifer had been divorced 3 years ago, understood something about rebuilding after a relationship ended badly, though we didn't dwell on past pain as much as acknowledge it existed. She was funny and smart and comfortable in her own skin, in ways that felt mature and appealing. When she suggested dinner the following week, I agreed, and realized I was interested in getting to know her better without the weight of expectation or the fear of repetition that had kept me isolated for so long. The dinner went well, then a second dinner, then a Sunday morning hike through Great Falls that left us both sweating and laughing and planning the next adventure. We were taking things slowly, neither of us rushing toward labels or commitments, just spending time together and seeing where it led. I told her about the canceled wedding after our 4th date, the whole story, including the rehearsal dinner exposure and the aftermath. She listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and then said she appreciated my honesty and was impressed by how I'd handled such a difficult situation. Her response felt measured and mature, neither making too much of it nor dismissing it as insignificant, just accepting it as part of my history without letting it define my present. August marked 9 months since everything fell apart. 3/4 of a year that had somehow transformed from the worst period of my life into something that looked increasingly like a gift. I was healthier, happier, and more aligned with my values than I'd been in years. The nonprofit consulting practice was thriving. I had enough clients to be selective about projects and enough income to live comfortably while doing work I believed in. My relationship with Jennifer was developing into something real and substantial, built on honest communication and mutual respect instead of the performance and deception I'd experienced with Simone. My life looked nothing like the one I'd planned, and I was grateful for every deviation from that original path. I got an unexpected email in mid-August from the venue where the wedding should have happened. They were hosting a nonprofit fundraiser in September and wondered if I'd be interested in attending, given my work in the sector. The irony wasn't lost on me, returning to the site of my canceled wedding for a professional event, but I'd learned something about facing things instead of avoiding them. I RSVP'd yes and bought a ticket, then mentioned it to Jennifer, who offered to come with me as my date if I wanted the support. I appreciated the offer but declined, feeling like this was something I needed to do alone, a final confrontation with a ghost that had been haunting me. The night of the fundraiser, I drove to the venue in Maryland, parked in the same lot where I'd planned to arrive on my wedding day, and walked through the gardens that looked spectacular in September twilight. The ballroom was decorated for the event, filled with nonprofit professionals and donors networking over wine and appetizers, and I mingled easily, comfortable in this world I'd made for myself. During dinner, I sat at a table with people I'd met through my work, had conversations about program outcomes and funding strategies and impact measurement, and realized I was genuinely enjoying myself in a space that should have been haunted by painful memories. After dinner, I excused myself and walked out to the gardens alone, stood in the spot where the ceremony would have taken place. The autumn flowers were blooming, the air was cool and perfect, and I tried to imagine what this night would have looked like if everything had gone according to plan. I'd be married to Simone, probably dancing in that ballroom with all our family and friends, believing I was happy while living a lie I didn't know existed. The thought was sobering. The recognition that the life I'd wanted so desperately would have been built on a foundation of betrayal and deception that would have eventually destroyed me anyway, just more slowly and perhaps more completely than the public exposure had. I felt someone approach and turned to find Angela, who'd also been invited to the fundraiser through her organization. She stood beside me looking at the gardens and said she knew this was where my wedding was supposed to happen, that Jennifer had mentioned it when explaining why I'd wanted to come alone. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment before she said something that shifted my entire perspective. She said she believed everything happened for a reason, not in some mystical predetermined way, but because our choices and reactions to circumstances created meaning from chaos. She said the man I'd become over the past 9 months was someone who never would have existed if I'd married Simone, that sometimes we needed to lose the life we planned to discover the life we were meant to live. I thought about that phrase while driving home, about the life I was meant to live versus the life I'd planned. The old plan had been conventional and safe, following the expected path of marriage and mortgage and climbing the corporate ladder. The new reality was riskier and more authentic, built around work that mattered and relationships that were honest, and a version of myself that was stronger and more self-aware than the man who'd stood on that stage 10 months ago showing videos of his fiancée's betrayal. The revenge I'd taken that night had felt important at the time, necessary even, but the real victory wasn't the public exposure. It was everything that came after, the rebuilding and growing and discovering that I could survive the worst thing I'd experienced and come out better for it. September brought the actual anniversary of what would have been my wedding day. Jennifer asked if I wanted company, and I said yes this time, ready to mark the occasion with someone who represented my present instead of dwelling alone on the past. We spent the day hiking in Shenandoah, challenging trails that required focus and effort, reaching a summit just before sunset where we could see for miles in every direction. Standing there looking at the view, I felt something release that I hadn't known I was still holding. The anger was gone completely, replaced by something closer to gratitude for lessons learned and bullets dodged and the unexpected paths that suffering can open when you let it teach you instead of destroy you. That evening over dinner at a small restaurant in a mountain town, Jennifer asked me if I'd forgiven Simone and Marcus yet. It was the first time she'd asked directly, and I realized the answer had changed without me noticing exactly when. I told her yes, I had, not because they deserved it, or because what they did was acceptable, but because carrying unforgiveness was costing me more than they were worth. I'd forgiven them the way you forgive a debt you know will never be repaid, by releasing your claim to it and moving forward unburdened. She reached across the table and took my hand, said she was proud of me for getting there, and I felt seen in a way that was both vulnerable and safe. The conversation turned to future plans, to the consulting practice and potential travel, and the nonprofit fundraiser we were both attending next month. We talked about Jennifer's job opportunity in Seattle that she was considering, about whether long distance could work or if one of us would need to relocate. The discussion was hypothetical but real, acknowledging that we were building towards something serious even if we weren't ready to name it yet. I found myself thinking about commitment differently than I had with Simone, approaching it with more caution but also more wisdom, understanding that trust was something built slowly through consistent action rather than promised quickly through romantic declarations. October arrived with the same crisp air and changing leaves that had marked the canceled wedding exactly 1 year ago. I woke up on what would have been my first anniversary feeling peaceful rather than bitter, grateful rather than grieving. The year had been the hardest of my life, but also the most transformative, breaking me down to foundations and forcing me to rebuild from materials I hadn't known I possessed. I'd learned things about resilience and authenticity and the difference between the life you plan and the life you're capable of living when circumstances force you beyond your comfort zone. I spent the morning of the anniversary swimming laps, the routine that had carried me through the worst months now just a pleasant habit that kept me grounded. The pool was crowded with the usual Saturday morning regulars, including Angela, who'd become one of my closest friends over the past year. After swimming, we grabbed coffee like we did most weekends, talked about her upcoming move to a new position, and my decision about whether to follow Jennifer to Seattle or ask her to stay in D.C. The conversation was easy and supportive, the kind of friendship that had emerged from shared ritual and mutual respect rather than years of history. My phone buzzed with a message from Raymond checking in, making sure I was okay on what he still called the day that could have been. I appreciated his loyalty even though I didn't need the protection anymore, sent back a message thanking him and telling him I was good, genuinely good, better than I'd been in years. He responded with a photo from a Nationals game he was at, asked if I wanted to join him next weekend, and I said yes, looking forward to normal friendship activities that had nothing to do with dramatic confrontations or emotional crises. I drove to my parents' house for lunch, a standing Sunday tradition I'd maintained throughout the year even when getting out of bed felt impossible. My mother had made pot roast and my father was watching football, and we sat around the kitchen table like we'd done my entire childhood, comfortable and familiar. They asked about Jennifer and the consulting practice and whether I'd decided about Seattle, questions about my future rather than dwelling on my past. My mother mentioned she'd run into Simone's mother at the grocery store, that there had been an awkward moment of eye contact before both of them looked away and continued shopping. She said she didn't feel angry anymore, just sad about the whole situation, about how things that seemed so certain could fall apart so completely. That afternoon I did something I'd been planning for weeks. I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried, the one who'd raised me as much as my parents had, who'd died 2 years before the canceled wedding. I sat by her headstone and told her everything that had happened, the whole story from the rehearsal dinner exposure to the year of recovery to the life I'd built from the rubble. I told her about the nonprofit work and Jennifer and the decision I'd made about Seattle. I'd decided to go, to take the risk of following someone to a new city and starting over completely, because playing it safe had nearly locked me into a marriage that would have destroyed me slowly from the inside. As the sun started setting, I drove to the restaurant where the rehearsal dinner had happened, parked across the street and just sat in my car looking at the building. I thought about the man I'd been a year ago, standing on that stage with the microphone and the videos and the absolute certainty that public exposure was the right choice. I didn't regret it exactly, but I understood it differently now. The revenge hadn't been about punishing Simone and Marcus as much as it had been about reclaiming my own narrative, refusing to be the fool who didn't know he was being betrayed, taking control of a situation where I'd been powerless. It had worked in the moment, but the real work had come after, in the months of rebuilding and processing and learning to trust again. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I'd been writing thoughts over the past year, scrolling through entries that tracked my evolution from rage to acceptance to something approaching wisdom. The early entries were bitter and angry, filled with fantasies of revenge and elaborate plans for making them suffer. The middle entries were sad and confused, trying to make sense of what happened and whether I'd done something wrong. The recent entries were hopeful and forward-looking, focused on gratitude and growth and the unexpected gifts that had emerged from the worst experience of my life. I'd become someone I liked better, someone more authentic and purposeful and alive. That evening, Jennifer came over and we cooked dinner together in my apartment, the one I'd moved to after purging every reminder of Simone from my life. We made pasta and drank wine and talked about the logistics of the Seattle move, about selling furniture and finding a new apartment, and how her job would start in January, which gave us 2 months to plan everything. She asked if I was scared, and I said yes, absolutely, but that fear felt different now than it used to. It felt like the appropriate response to taking a big risk rather than a warning sign that I was making a mistake. I'd learned to distinguish between fear that protected me and fear that limited me, and this was definitely the latter. After dinner, we sat on the couch where I'd spent so many sleepless nights in those early months, where I'd boxed up Simone's belongings and made the decision to delete the evidence folder and chosen forgiveness over continued rage. Jennifer leaned against me and we watched the city lights through the window, comfortable in the silence that came from not needing to fill every moment with words. She said something about how strange it was that my canceled wedding had led to us meeting, that if I'd married Simone, I never would have started swimming at the pool, and never would have met Angela, and never would have been at that birthday party where we first talked. She said she was grateful for my pain, even though she wished I hadn't had to experience it, because it had created the path that led to this moment. I thought about all the people who'd been part of this year of transformation. Raymond with his fierce loyalty and occasionally misguided protection. My parents with their steady support and refusal to let me disappear into isolation. Pastor Williams with his sermon about betrayal and his private counsel about forgiveness. Angela, with her friendship that asked nothing and offered everything. The clients who'd trusted me with their missions and helped me discover work that felt meaningful. And Jennifer, who'd entered my life when I was finally ready to risk connection again, who'd seen my history and chosen to build a future anyway. All of them had contributed to rebuilding what Marcus and Simone had broken, proving that betrayal didn't have to be the end of the story but could be the beginning of something better. As midnight approached, marking the official end of what would have been my wedding anniversary, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. The revenge I'd taken a year ago had been dramatic and public and satisfying in the moment. But the real revenge was this life I'd built, this version of myself that was stronger and wiser, and more aligned with my values than the man who'd planned to marry Simone. The best revenge wasn't making them suffer, wasn't destroying their careers or reputations or futures. The best revenge was becoming someone who no longer needed revenge at all, who could look back at their betrayal and see it as the catalyst that freed me to discover who I was meant to be. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in David's place? Leave your comment, like this video, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you want another powerful story, click on the video appearing to your left.